Stop. Let's get started. See new video.
It was still early, the soft gray of dawn creeping through the window as the first rays of the sun began to pierce the sky. Ethan stirred beneath his covers, his alarm clock still a few minutes away from ringing. He wasn't an early riser by nature, but he had been reading about morning routines lately, how they could make or break the course of a day, how they could set the tone for everything that followed. And lately, Ethan had been feeling a little lost. His days blurred together in a haze of routines that didn't inspire him, didn't motivate him, didn't push him to move toward the goals he had once set for himself. The night before, he had vowed to make a change. He wanted to wake up earlier, not just to have more time in his day, but to start the day on the right foot. He had read about the importance of morning rituals, how the first moments of your day had the potential to shape everything that followed. There were stories of people who got up at 5 a.m. to meditate, to write, to work out, of people who had taken control of their mornings and, in turn, had taken control of their lives. Ethan had decided that today would be the day he would try to harness that power. His alarm clock buzzed, piercing the silence in his room. He groggily reached for it, pressing the snooze button as he struggled to pry himself from the warmth of his bed. The temptation to fall back asleep was strong, but he remembered his vow. He had to get up. He swung his legs out of bed, planting his feet on the floor. The cold wood felt grounding beneath him. For a moment, he stood still, taking in the stillness of the morning, the quiet air, the way the world outside was only just beginning to stir. Ethan had never realized how peaceful this time of day could be. Without thinking too much, he moved toward the window, drawing the curtains aside. The view was breathtaking. The sun had barely risen, but already lit the horizon in soft pinks and oranges. It wasn't the spectacular, fiery sunrise that poets and photographers would fawn over. But for Ethan, it was something new, something calming. The world was waking up, and so was he. For a long moment, Ethan stood there, taking it all in. The colors, the serenity, the promise of a new day. He could feel the beginnings of something stirring inside him. It wasn't a rush of excitement or energy, but it was a quiet understanding, a realization that this moment, the very beginning of the day, held more power than he had ever thought possible. Okay, he whispered to himself, a sense of determination setting in. Let's start this day right. Ethan had read countless books, articles, and blogs about the best way to begin a day. From journaling to stretching to cold showers, everyone had their own take on what worked. But one thing kept popping up over and over again. Start with something simple, something intentional, something that centers you. That was the key. Instead of reaching straight for his phone, which was usually the first thing he did in the morning, scrolling through social media or checking emails, he decided to try something different. He reached for the notebook he kept on his bedside table, one that was filled with all his hopes, dreams, and random thoughts from the past few months. Opening it, he found a blank page, the promise of fresh beginnings staring back at him. He took a deep breath, and then he began to write. "I will make today count," he wrote in bold letters at the top of the page. "I will focus on what matters, and I will take one step closer to my goals." It felt small, this simple declaration, but as he wrote, he felt a shift. The words were powerful. They were a commitment to himself, a promise that he would show up for his life, even if just for today. He paused for a moment after writing that line, reflecting on his intentions. He wasn't promising perfection or success. He was promising effort. He put the pen down and closed the notebook, feeling a quiet sense of satisfaction. The first step had been taken, a small but meaningful step toward creating a day that had purpose. But Ethan knew this wouldn't be enough. One act of intentionality was just the beginning. He needed to create a chain of actions that would keep him motivated, moving, and focused. He headed to the kitchen, determined to nourish his body in a way that would fuel both his mind and spirit. Ethan had always been a fan of breakfast, but it had become a rushed affair, something he grabbed quickly on his way out the door, if he even bothered at all. Today, he was going to make it different. He wanted to take his time with this meal, to savor it, to let it be part of his ritual. He opened the fridge and surveyed his options. He could go for a quick protein bar, or maybe just cereal. But then he remembered something he'd read about the importance of starting the day with balanced nutrition, something that would keep him energized and focused. He pulled out eggs, spinach, and a few tomatoes. He set the pan on the stove, heating it up, and cracked the eggs into a bowl. As he whisked them together, he felt a small surge of pride. This wasn't complicated, but it felt intentional, an act of care for himself, of honoring his body. As the eggs sizzled in the pan, he added the spinach and tomatoes, watching them wilt and soften. The aroma filled the room, comforting and grounding. It was a simple meal, but it was exactly what he needed. Nourishment that didn't just feed his body, but helped him feel more awake, more alive. Ethan sat down at the kitchen table with his plate, taking a deep breath as he took the first bite. There was something about eating slowly, savoring each flavor, that brought a sense of peace. He wasn't rushing through this meal to get to the next thing. He was present, and as he ate, a thought bubbled up. He realized that this deliberate action of nourishing himself was one of the keys to feeling motivated. It wasn't about waiting for some grand inspiration to strike. It was about small, intentional actions, one after the other, that created momentum. This meal, this moment, was part of that. He finished his breakfast slowly, feeling more awake, more present, more ready to take on the day. After finishing his breakfast, Ethan felt the familiar pull of hesitation. He had always known that exercise was important, but it was easy to put it off. It was always a matter of finding time, or waiting for the motivation to strike, or letting the comforts of the morning win. But today felt different. Today, Ethan had decided to show up, and he wasn't going to let excuses stand in his way. He grabbed his sneakers, tying them tightly as he prepared to step out the door. He wasn't planning anything extreme, just a short jog around the block. But even that small act felt like a challenge, something that required intention. The crisp morning air greeted him as he stepped outside, and he inhaled deeply, filling his lungs with fresh air. He began with a light stretch, easing his muscles into movement. His body felt stiff, the result of too many hours spent hunched over a desk or on the couch. But as he stretched and moved, a sense of energy started to build inside him. It was subtle at first, like a spark starting to catch. But with each stretch and movement, it grew stronger. The first few steps of his jog were slow, tentative, but they soon turned into a steady rhythm. His feet hit the pavement in time with his breath. The world around him was still quiet, save for the sound of his feet and the occasional chirp of birds in the trees. The beauty of the morning, the stillness of the world, made the jog feel almost meditative. As he ran, Ethan noticed a shift inside him. There was something about moving his body, about getting his blood flowing, that unlocked a sense of clarity. The mental fog that had clouded his mind earlier seemed to lift, and with each stride, he felt more focused, more grounded. He wasn't running to break records or to achieve some fitness goal. He was running to clear his mind, to set the tone for the day. It was an act of self-care, of showing up for himself. And as he continued, he felt a quiet motivation building. It wasn't about pushing himself to the limit. It was about starting the day with intention, about taking control of the energy he brought to the rest of his activities. By the time he returned home, his body was warm and his mind clear. His heart was beating steadily, and a feeling of accomplishment settled over him. It wasn't about how far he ran or how fast. It was about the fact that he had moved, that he had done something for himself, something that had a direct impact on how he felt. And in that moment, Ethan realized that motivation didn't come from waiting for a surge of energy. It came from taking action, no matter how small. As he walked back inside, he realized that the morning was already starting to feel like it was slipping away. The rush of tasks, emails, and to-do lists would soon creep in. But Ethan had made a decision. He wasn't going to let this morning slip through his fingers without making it count. He headed to his living room, where a cozy armchair awaited him. Sitting down, he took a deep breath, closing his eyes. He had heard so much about the benefits of meditation, of taking a few moments each day to center the mind and calm the constant noise. Today he would give it a try. After all, he had nothing to lose. At first, the silence was almost overwhelming. He had gotten so used to the constant hum of notifications and background noise in his life that the stillness felt foreign. His mind wandered, as it always did, thinking about what he had to do next, replaying past conversations, worrying about things that hadn't happened yet. But he remembered something he'd read. When thoughts come, let them pass like clouds in the sky. So he gently let those thoughts drift by. He focused on his breath, taking slow, deliberate inhales, holding for a moment, then exhaling. With each breath, His mind began to quiet, a peaceful stillness settling over him. It wasn't perfect, but that was okay. He didn't need perfection. He just needed presence. Ethan sat there for 10 minutes, simply being, simply breathing. When he opened his eyes again, he felt lighter. His thoughts weren't entirely gone, but they weren't as overwhelming either. The simple act of sitting still and focusing on the present had brought a sense of clarity that he hadn't expected. It was amazing, he thought. In just a short period of time, he had cultivated a calmness that would carry him into the rest of the day. The mental chatter had quieted, and he felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. By the time Ethan was finished with his morning routine, the day had officially begun. The world outside his window had come to life. The sounds of traffic, distant conversations, and the usual hustle and bustle of the city filling the air. But for Ethan, it didn't feel overwhelming. He felt grounded, centered, and ready. He glanced at his to-do list, which had been looming over him for days. It was long, daunting, and filled with tasks that he had been putting off. But instead of feeling anxious, he felt a quiet confidence. He had spent the morning focusing on himself, and now he was ready to focus on the tasks at hand. He started with the hardest one, the task that had been weighing on him the most. And as he worked through it, he found that the motivation he had been searching for earlier had been with him all along. It wasn't a rush of energy or excitement. It was a quiet determination, the result of the small actions he had taken that morning. The morning routine wasn't about forcing himself to feel motivated. It was about creating an environment where motivation could flourish naturally. As he ticked off item after item from his list, Ethan realized that the secret to starting his day with motivation wasn't about waiting for the perfect moment. It was about creating the perfect conditions. It was about small, intentional steps, nourishing his body, moving his muscles, quieting his mind, and then, most importantly, taking action. By the end of the day, as the sun began to set, Ethan sat back and reflected on how far he had come. He hadn't just tackled his to-do list. He had set the tone for his entire day. He had created a rhythm of motivation that flowed naturally from one action to the next, each one reinforcing the other. And as he closed his eyes that night, ready to sleep and recharge for the next day, he knew one thing for sure. Starting his day with intention, with purpose, was the key to making every day a little better, a little more meaningful. The next morning, Ethan woke up with a sense of familiarity. The alarm went off, but this time, instead of the usual grogginess, he was greeted with a quiet energy, as if his body was already primed for the day. The early light filtered through his window once again, but it didn't feel like a jarring start. It felt like a gentle invitation. He paused before jumping out of bed, just as he had the previous day. His mind was calm, and his body felt strong from the simple jog he had done the day before. There was no rush. Instead of immediately reaching for his phone, Ethan sat up and took a moment to reflect. His morning routine wasn't something he had to force. It had become a part of him now, and he was beginning to realize that the motivation he'd been seeking for so long wasn't something that could be manufactured out of thin air. It was the natural result of consistent, small actions done with intention. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, his feet touching the cool floor. He was awake now, fully awake, in both body and mind. It was time to start the day, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. The first thing he did was reach for his notebook again. He wrote out his intention for the day. But this time, instead of focusing solely on tasks, he wrote, "Today, I will be present. I will take things one step at a time. I will trust the process and know that each action I take brings me closer to where I want to be." It was a simple shift from the previous day's promise, but it felt like a deeper commitment to himself. It was about trusting the journey rather than forcing the outcome. His morning ritual had become more than just a series of actions. It had become a mindset, a framework for how he wanted to approach life. As the days passed, Ethan began to notice subtle but significant changes. The first was how much clearer his mind felt. He was more focused on the present moment. The distractions that had once overwhelmed him seemed to fade away, and the things that had once felt impossible now felt manageable. The small act of creating a morning routine had given him the clarity to approach his challenges with a sense of calm instead of stress. He was also beginning to appreciate the importance of flexibility. His morning routine wasn't always perfect. There were mornings when he woke up late or when life got in the way. But instead of beating himself up or abandoning his routine entirely, he allowed himself room for imperfection. On days when he couldn't fit in a jog, he focused on a simple stretch. If he didn't have time to meditate, he focused on a few deep breaths as he got ready for the day. The key wasn't about perfection. It was about consistency, showing up for himself in whatever way he could, day after day. One morning, when he sat down to journal, he realized that the most important lesson he had learned was not about motivation at all. It wasn't about waiting for the perfect moment to feel driven or inspired. It was about creating a solid foundation from which motivation could naturally arise. The routine, the intentionality, the care he was giving to his body and mind. It was all contributing to a deeper sense of purpose. Ethan had also noticed a shift in how he approached his work. Instead of feeling overwhelmed by his to-do list, he tackled each task one at a time, knowing that he had set the tone for the day. He wasn't rushing through everything, trying to squeeze it all in. He was present. He was patient. And with that patience came more productivity than he had ever experienced before. He realized that motivation wasn't about pushing harder. It was about working smarter, with focus, and with a clear mind. As he continued with his routine, the results rippled outward, affecting all areas of his life. His relationships improved because he was more present. His physical health improved because he had made movement a priority. Even his creativity began to flow more freely because his mind was clearer, less bogged down by stress and worry. Each morning, he was setting the stage for a day that aligned with his goals and values. A few weeks passed, and Ethan found himself reflecting on how much had changed. It wasn't just the mornings that had transformed, it was his entire outlook on life. The act of setting aside time for himself each day had fostered a deep sense of connection to who he was, what he wanted, and why he was doing it all. Ethan no longer felt like he was chasing motivation. It was no longer something he had to force or manufacture. It was something that came naturally, as a result of his commitment to the small, intentional actions he took each day. The mornings had become his sacred time, a ritual that prepared him for whatever challenges or opportunities the day might bring. There was no longer the nagging sense of being overwhelmed by everything on his plate. He had learned that the key to motivation wasn't about a grand, momentous burst of energy. It was about the quiet accumulation of consistent actions. He had discovered that the best way to start his day with motivation wasn't about finding the perfect routine or waiting for the right moment. It was about showing up for himself, taking care of his body, mind, and spirit, and creating an environment where motivation could flourish. It wasn't about perfection, it was about progress, and every small step forward counted. And that was how Ethan finally realized the truth. Motivation wasn't something that could be chased or forced. It was something that came from within, through the small actions that made up each day.